Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. David Bassano, and this is a report on the human rights situation in Ukraine in March 2022, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of that country. Here's a little historical background. Ukraine has existed as an independent state since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Over the next 2 decades, the nation was engaged in a debate over whether to face east or west, that is, to develop greater ties with Western Europe or with Russia. The Russian government, particularly under Vladimir Putin, wanted Russian influence to remain strong in Ukraine, and in particular to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. In 2013, protests erupted in Ukraine following then President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to suspend trade agreements with Western Europe and turn instead to Russia for closer economic ties. These protests developed into the Maidan Revolution, which overthrew Yanukovych and established a new government. Knowing that this change would mean a turn towards the West, Putin invaded and occupied both the Donbass and Crimea regions of Ukraine in March 2014, declaring them to be independent states and setting up pro-Russian governments there. These governments have no legitimacy under international law, and the Russian troops there are considered, under the Geneva Convention, as occupying forces. That invasion and the subsequent resistance to the occupation has killed over 16,000 people and made refugees of another 1.5 million. And in February of 2022, of course, Putin sent the bulk of the Russian army into Ukraine, apparently with the intention of occupying the entire nation. The war continues at the time of this recording. It is clear that Russia has violated the human rights of Ukrainians in two ways. The first is that simply to launch a war of aggression, that is, a war not justified on the grounds of self-defense, violates the right to life of everyone killed in the war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both in 2014 and 2022, is a clear and gross violation of the United Nations Charter. Article 2 of the Charter states, quote, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state," unquote. The only exceptions are acts of self-defense or wars authorized by the UN Security Council, neither of which apply to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ironically, Russia has claimed that the purpose of the invasion was to prevent the persecution of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Human rights observers have stated that this claim of persecution is false. Thus, the invasion may be illegal under international law, but does it constitute a human rights violation? Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides legal protection to the right to life and prohibits the arbitrary deprivation of life. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has stated that, quote, "States parties engaged in acts of aggression as defined in international law resulting in deprivation of life violate ipso facto Article 6 of the Covenant," unquote. This covenant is part of the International Bill of Human Rights, and violating it is a clear violation of human rights laws and norms. Second, we should consider whether Russia has committed other specific violation of human rights laws in Ukraine as part of its invasion. The primary international laws dealing with human rights violations during wartime are the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The foremost concern of these laws is the protection of civilians. It is illegal to specifically target civilians or civilian infrastructures, such as hospitals and schools, during a war. Militaries at war are also obligated to refrain from tactics, whenever possible, which cannot discriminate between civilian and military targets. For example, bombarding large areas of mixed military and civilian targets is considered a violation, as is using weapons such as cluster bombs, which affect everyone in a large area indiscriminately. According to credible reports, Russian forces in Ukraine have committed many such violations, such as bombarding schools, hospitals, theaters, and apartment blocks, none of which are considered legitimate military targets. It seems that Russian forces are instead determined to terrorize the population of the country so as to demoralize them. Furthermore, all other violations of human rights are still violations during wartime. A war is no excuse to commit crimes. During the 2014 Russian occupation of Donbass and Crimea, human rights NGOs noted instances of extrajudicial executions, torture, and disappearances by Russian forces. On March 2nd, 2022, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced that the court would be conducting an investigation of any and all war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine since 2013. If credible evidence of a crime is found, those responsible could be prosecuted at The Hague. I plan to record another update when the ICC publishes the results of its investigation. It is important that those committing human rights abuses be prosecuted, not just to gain justice for the victims, but also to discourage future abuses by those thinking themselves above the law. I'll talk to you soon.